Chapter 12, Services, Key Issue 2, Content Objective. Where are consumer services distributed? So students will be able to explain where consumer services are distributed. The ICANN statements for Key Issue 2. 1. Identify key components to Chris Dollar's central place theory and explain how it's used to describe a service location. 2. Explain the distribution of different size settlements using the rank size rule and the impact of primate cities. 3. Define threshold, range, and marketplace. Marketplace is also known as a hinterland. 4. Explain how to use threshold and range to find the optimal location for a service and define a hinterland. 5. Compare the gravity model with the central place theory in defining optimal service location. 6. Compare and contrast periodic services in developed and developing countries. Compare or contrast periodic services in developed or developing countries. Central place theory. Geographers use it to help determine a service location. Consumer services generally follow a regular pattern based on the size of settlements, as we'll see with Walter Chris Dollar's central place theory model. When we look at central place theory, the main objective is to find the most profitable location for a consumer service location. The German geographer known as Walter Chris Dollar studied the southern area of Germany, and then it was later in the 1930s, and with this he came up with regular pattern of what is a hexagon, and a hexagon is the shape used because it's the least overlapping of services. So it's the one shape with the least amount of gaps. And he based his findings on regular settlement patterns based on size of settlements. Larger settlements offering not only more consumer services but also specialized ones. So then we can think of as in this diagram we can see that this larger settlement has this as its hinterland, which we'll talk about here in a second, has the most specialized services and the most services available. As you get further out into another area, smaller town or smaller settlement size, they would have less specialization and less services, according to Chris Dollar's central place theory. Central place theory, it's important to determine the market area. The market area is also known as the hinterland. So we have the center, which is where the services, the node of services. And then we look at the hinterland is the surrounding area that are patrons of that service, that are customers willing to buy. So again, this shows us the market area, the hinterland, and then this is the distance, the range is the distance a person is willing to travel to acquire or buy the service. All right, again, range is that, what I just showed on that last slide, is that distance a patron or consumer is willing to travel. Keep in mind, people travel shorter distances for everyday services like groceries or movie rentals. They're known as non-basic services. People travel further for basic services, such as like concerts or professional sporting events, or other specialized consumer services. People oftentimes, not only will they travel, but they won't think of distance in terms of time, but rather in terms of a linear measure, such as miles or kilometers. Threshold is the minimum number of patrons or consumers needed to generate enough sales to create a profit. In other words, to support the longevity of that service. We can look at daily urban systems have represented functional ties, which we can be considered market areas for some services seen in this diagram. We can see that many of these regions are interconnected with the central place theory, which we begin to see what is formed as mega regions now. And mega regions a generation earlier, authors Doxidris and Berry, the U.S. Commerce allocated that there are 48 contiguous states to 171 function regions. So these are all regions, and then also the names would be hubs, which signifies a daily urban system or interconnected with these urban areas. Again, known as mega regions that apply to central place theory. Here we look at the hexagon, because again, the hexagon shape has the least overlapping or the least amount of gaps. And what creates these settlement sizes is competition. So competition will draw the line of where the range and the threshold is. All right, as I already mentioned, hexagons do not overlap, and it's a breaking point, showing where a service, the purchasing or willingness to buy a service ends. And usually that breaking point is equidistant from the similar service, halfway point between similar services. When we look at consumer services, they have small thresholds, short ranges, and small markets. They're found in small settlements. Larger settlements, they have larger thresholds, larger ranges, and larger market areas. Like we talked about with specialization of large settlements, where you see those basic services like movie theaters and sporting events. And then when we look at developed countries, they have numerous small settlements with very few large settlements, but those very few large settlements are going to have tremendously large ranges and thresholds of whatever service. Usually it's going to be a specialized consumer service or a business service that would be found in those large settlements, again with a very large threshold and a large range. Take a moment to review. All right, continuing on with Kristallr's central place theory. Kristallr said due to competition, there were most services would form different levels of market areas. And so he noted that the various sizes are in the shape of a hexagon. And he said that when we look at these shapes, we can see the levels of market areas with hamlets, which is the smallest, then village is second smallest, and third is a town, and then city being the largest, without any overlapping. We can look at this chart right here. We can see that the main cities would be, like right here would be a main city with this large hexagon, and this large city would be, you could see it as a city, and that city, according to Kristallr, is going to have more than 3,000 inhabitants, and usually that city is going to offer more specialized consumer services. Then you go to towns, which are these blues, which are smaller hexagons. So these blue smaller hexagons will tell us that they usually have about 1,000 to 3,000 inhabitants, and they have smaller ranges and thresholds of services that are offered. And then you can go even smaller to villages, and the villages are going to be these little blue, and so this would be a village. And we can see the settlement size decreases in size. It's more rural, and villages are often between 100 and 999 inhabitants, and they have very basic low order consumer services. And then you look at the smallest size, and that's a hamlet. That's the hamlet. And then where the village was these. All right, so again, we see that there are different sizes of market areas based on settlement size. Kristallr had some assumptions. He thought all land was isotropic, meaning flat. He also thought population was evenly distributed, and also resources were evenly distributed. And also purchasing power was the same for all consumers. When you look at Minot, North Dakota, we can see that Minot's the largest city. It has 48,000 inhabitants. So Minot will be the most specialized city. In fact, it'll be the only city within this map that will have a Walmart. So we have a specialized retail consumer service. And then you see the other smaller towns as you go from city to small towns. Right here, other smaller towns, and those are going to be less specialized. They're going to have 1,000 to 3,000 inhabitants. Then you go to a village, and that's going to be 100 to 999 inhabitants. And again, the range and threshold and consumer service, number of consumer services and specialization in consumer services will be very basic or basic consumptive. And then you have the smallest market area, which are the hamlets, which are brown. And again, hamlets, you're looking at fewer than 100 inhabitants, and the consumer basic services are most likely just going to be like a gas station or a convenience store. All right, this leads to rank size rule. Rank size rule says 1/n of the population of the largest settlement. So we look at plotting a straight line, and we look at there should be a regular pattern that follows that logarithmic straight line that starts in the upper left and slants right, which we'll take a look at here in a second. And there's also, if they don't follow the rank size rule, they're going to be seen as primate cities. In primate cities, the largest city has more than twice the amount of population as the second largest city. An example would be the primate city of Mexico City, which is 10 times larger than the fifth largest settlement of Toluca. All right, and the primate city is a concern because consumers won't have access to basic goods or services. If it follows the rank size rule, then we're going to know there are more smaller settlements and there's fewer large settlements. Primate city, there's more large settlements and fewer small settlements. All right, looking at the rank size rule and how to apply it, we can see here it tells the relationship between the cities and market areas and size of settlements and their population. So we take a look at the largest town, you take the population, and then if you divide that population by 2, you should have the population roughly or approximately the second largest city. And again, for the third largest city, you take the largest populated city and divide it by 3, and that will give you the third largest city. And then you keep moving on along that continuum to find the ranks and sizes. And it should be a logarithmic line that slants from the upper left to the lower right. Here's a look at the rank size rule. We can see that Los Angeles, we see the number 2 city here. With the number 2 city, we can see Los Angeles. Well, whereas Los Angeles is about 12 million. New York City should be up here. So it doesn't have to be an exact line that goes upper left to lower right, but it roughly follows that logarithmic line that slants downward to the right. And so we can see that the United States follows the rank size rule. So Houston, the 5th largest city, should be 20 million people divided by 5. So roughly 4 million, but it's 4 to 6, so it doesn't have to be approximate. We can see it follow the rank size rule. We look at Mexico, we can see Mexico follows the primate city rule. Over 20 million is their largest city of Mexico City, and their second largest city is below 5 million. So Mexico City is nearly 4 times the population size as Guadalajara. With this rank size rule, we look at the hierarchy of consumer services. Here we can look left at Houston, and we can see that Houston, the 5th largest settlement, has a larger population than the rank size rule predicts. And then we can see Mexico's the 5th, or Toluca on On the right, Mexico's fifth largest city has a similar population than the rank size rule would suggest. Looking at a market area analysis, when we're doing a market area analysis, the geographers are using the information to find the most profitable location. First, they would do a market area analysis. They would compute the range, and estimating the range is typically done with zip codes of credit card customers that are willing to purchase and buy the service. And then the threshold is commonly the thresholds vary. Again, that's the minimum amount of profit that's needed to sustain a business. Thresholds can vary, and oftentimes you'll have to look at a comparative service. For instance, like threshold for like a Family Dollar store requires 25,000 patrons a year, whereas Target has a larger threshold where they require 100,000 patrons or consumers a year. So oftentimes threshold you use by looking at comparative services. Then the next thing you would do is you would then draw your market area and where the location would be. And there might be more than one existing location for a market area. That's when you'll do a comparative store analysis. Here's a video in central place theory. All right, take a moment to review. Moving to gravity model. The gravity model is directly related to the number of people and inversely related to the distance people must travel. So when we want to minimize the distances that all potential customers must travel to reach the service. When looking at the gravity model, consumer behavior follows two patterns. One is the greatest number of potential customers for a service. You want to be located to the greatest number of customers per service. The second is the farther people are from a particular service, the less likely they are to use it. So people who live 1 kilometer or mile from a store are more likely to patronize or consume it than people that live 10 miles away. All right, so we want to minimize traveling and also locate near high population densities. Nutritionists are concerned with the market area analysis. People who live relatively far from resources, they have limited access to affordable healthcare or health food options or nutritious options. And these are called food deserts. And poorer urban areas and rural areas quite often are located in food deserts. It's estimated that by the USDA, so the United States Drug Department of Agriculture, estimates that 23.5% of Americans lived in a food desert in 2010. Here we look at a market area of Dayton. We can see that consumer services oftentimes will use the gravity model based on GDP or wealthy consumers, and then they will put locations. In this case, at Target stores and where they have a larger threshold, a larger range. The residents have to be wealthier, have to have the ability to buy retail and wholesale merchandise. And some of the stores might be more expensive or specialized, so they'll need even a higher GDP per capita. But we can see that there's a larger range for Target, there's a larger threshold, and then for Family Dollar, it has a much smaller range and smaller market areas, smaller hinterland. And then we could probably guess, where would food deserts be? Food deserts would be out here, where the poor reside, where there lack consumer services. Because it tells us where these areas do not have a consumer service, they don't have the ability to afford or buy a consumer service. So these would be areas where you'd see food deserts. people don't have access to proper nutrition. Those would be the poor areas of Dayton. All right, let's take a look. And I just pointed that out, but here we can see, as I pointed out, here are the food deserts. So again, areas where they don't have the wealth or GDP per capita or the purchasing power parity to buy a consumer service. And here's a look at the distribution of food deserts, percentage with no car and no supermarket within a mile. So when we talk about food deserts, it's important to keep in mind that people that live in poor areas, either they lack a car or transportation, or they also depend on public transportation, which has operating hours that are inconsistent with accessing food in a timely basis. Looking at periodic and sharing services, what we've seen with non-consumer services, they've changed a lot in both developing and developed countries. For instance, some groceries are sold in periodic markets. The sharing economy has led to more flexible consumer services. So when we look at periodic markets and sharing as services, developed countries, they have farmer markets, and they're usually on 1 or 2 days. They're selling fresh produce that they can't buy at a grocery store. The frequency will vary by culture. Developing countries, most oftentimes, these are areas where they can't access consumer services. So these are the areas that would be follow the primate city rule, where they are dispersed where there's poor population, and the days will vary. But again, there'll be sparse population, low incomes, and the purchasing power parity will be too low for any consumer services to have a node in those regions. We look at food deserts, as already mentioned in the last slide, can sometimes be eradicated through periodic markets such as farmers markets, but oftentimes those farmer markets in more developed regions are located in like a town or a square or a government center. Sharing services. These are commonly found in lodging and transportation. They're a challenge to services because is it a consumer service or a business service? For instance, when we look at Lyft and Uber, this poses many challenges because now many don't try to hail a cab anymore or call a number for a cab. Many people have an app on their smartphone where they can summons a Lyft driver, and that Lyft driver will confirm the desired location, the current pickup, and then also it will confirm the passenger has paid for the ride. So this challenge comes about when we look at urban Uber claims several million drivers are independent contractors. However, some government regulators insist that they are classified as employees because of the ride-sharing company's responsibility to screen, train, and insure them. So you now debate. Is it a consumer service or is it a business service? It's up to you. All right, looking at the periodic and sharing services, we can see here is a periodic market in rural France. And again, we can see the cultural values that play into the frequency of periodic markets. Take a moment and review what you've learned. All right, and again, make sure you can answer the I can statements. That'll conclude key issue 2.